name is Nicola Jennings. I'm the director of Athena Art Foundation. Welcome to the talk tonight. We are a non-profit. We opened about 2 years ago, and we promote pre-modern art using digital platforms primarily, and we do all sorts of talks, monthly talks. So we hope if you haven't been before, you'll come again. And we also have an Instagram site and a YouTube page and a website with articles and things. So please do check us out. Anyway, tonight, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Lois Oliver. Lois is Professor of Art History at the University of Notre Dame in London and a visiting lecturer at the Courtauld Institute. She's worked as a curator at the National Gallery, at the V&A, and at the Royal Academy. And she is curator of Berthe Morisot, Shaping Impressionism, at Dulwich Picture Gallery, which she's going to talk to us about tonight. Before we start, though, I'm just going to warn you that we are actually recording this. We'll be recording all the discussion with Lois, but not the questions. So I hope that nobody will mind. You won't be able to see your names anyway. So Lois, can you tell us, thank you, first of all, thank you so much for coming. Can you tell us a bit about the genesis of the exhibition? Why Morisot and why at Dulwich?
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here talking to you today. Thank you for the invitation. In 2018, the director of Dulwich Picture Gallery, Jennifer Scott, got in touch with me and she invited me to propose an Impressionist exhibition. And I thought, yes, please. But also, this will be a challenge. Dulwich Picture Gallery is, of course, the oldest purpose-built public art gallery in the world. It's in a stunning building designed by the architect John Soane, and it has a superlative collection, but it's a collection of old master paintings from the 16th to the 18th centuries, no Impressionist pictures. So I knew we needed to be very strategic, and this needed to be a project that said something new that lenders would want to support. And it was also very important to me that it should have a specific connection to the location. So why Berthe Morisot? Well, this is the first major exhibition of Morisot's art in the UK since 1950, 73 years, and I'm sure we'll come back to why that might be. And I also knew that Berthe Morisot had a strong interest in 18th century art, and of course Dulwich does have an excellent 18th century collection. Her interest in French 18th century art was known, but it had never been explored in an exhibition before. And then there were these hints in her letters and notebooks that there was also a direct connection to English 18th century art and to London specifically. So I knew that there was huge potential to say something new that lenders would want to lend and that visitors would want to see in Dulwich.
Gosh, that's amazing. I mean, I went to see the exhibition, as you know, and I was totally blown away by it. I had no idea that she had that connection to, or that interest in 18th century art. And I think that was a completely brilliant idea if you was to put her at Dulwich or put her together with the Dulwich collection. So I've seen it, but I don't know whether all our viewers have seen it because we often have viewers coming from different parts of the world. So I wondered if you could just give us a quick tour, perhaps of the first room, to tell us what the main themes are.
Yes, of course. So you step in out of the main collection galleries into the world of Berthe Morisot. And I really wanted people to be surrounded by her art in that first room. And we let her introduce herself with her self-portrait. Here she is, standing tall and confident, really asserting her place in what was a male-dominated art world of 19th century Paris. And what I love about this is the bravura with which it's painted. You see in the lower left that flourish that indicates her palette and brushes. And then on her bodice are these red and blue embroidered flowers, and they look so like the red ribbon and star of the Légion d'honneur, France's highest order of merit. And of course, that honor had been bestowed on many male artists in the past, particularly those who conformed to traditional academic expectations. but only one woman had received the Légion d'honneur by this date, and that was the celebrated animal painter Rosa Bonheur. And I think that what Morisot is doing here is asserting her own new, bold, impressionist vision. And she was such an important figure. She was a core founder member of the Impressionist group. She exhibited in all 8 of their exhibitions held between 1874 and 86, with one exception, the 4th exhibition in 1879, which took place just a few months after the birth of her daughter. And crucially, she'd been exhibiting at the Paris Salon for a decade before that, from the age of 23. So she's not like some of the other Impressionists who are being constantly rejected from that salon. She's a really well-established professional.
Did she ever get the Légion d'honneur?
She didn't get the Légion d'honneur. She has to stick with that embroidered version. And what we really wanted to do was show the ways in which her art was distinctive in comparison with her male colleagues. And I'm especially pleased to have been able to reunite these 2 paintings in the exhibition, one from Stockholm, one from the National Gallery in London, both of them exhibited at the 5th Impressionist exhibition in 1880. Now, her male colleagues, they could freely roam the streets of Paris, they could paint the cafes, the theatres, the late night city spaces, but that wasn't available to Morisot as an upper middle class woman. So what you find is that her art really reflects her more constrained experience. She's painting at home, in private gardens, in public parks, safe spaces, and always in the daytime. And what we have here are the same 2 professional models wearing the same 2 outfits, painted on the same day in the Bois de Boulogne, which was the public park close to her Paris home. And it tells us so much about her practice, this, because even working in a public park, she had to be very strategic, because just setting up her easel in public could attract unwanted attention. So often her husband, Eugène Manet, the brother of the famous artist Edouard Manet, would accompany her. And she'd also start work very early in the morning, and her model Marie Renard, thought to be the woman in blue here, remembered that Morisot would ask them to meet her at 6:30 in the morning. Then by 9 o'clock, her picture would be finished and they'd be back at her house enjoying a cup of coffee. And if you look at the second picture on the right, you can see the models are sitting in a boat there, and so is Morisot, where they can work on the water undisturbed.
Nice.
The other thing that's so striking about her work is she's always painting modern life, but her contemporaries saw this connection to the 18th century. So the critic Charles Frissy, looking at this, he is reminded of the 18th century artist Fragonard. He says this fugitive lightness, this pleasant vivacity, sparkling and frivolous, recalls Fragonard. So in this first room, we're introducing that idea that this is how she was perceived, but also showing the visitors that it was a genuine interest for Morisot herself. And that is fascinating, because actually 18th century art had completely fallen from favour following the French Revolution because of that association with the old royal regime. But by the mid-19th century, it's being enthusiastically collected by collectors including Hippolyte Wolferdin and Louis Lecars, who makes a really important bequest to the Louvre in 1869. They open new rooms devoted to the era. There are exhibitions put on in Paris reintroducing this art to the public, and Morisot herself really shares that interest. And what you see here, this is the painting we chose for the exhibition poster. It's a young woman in a ball gown, absolutely the height of 1870s fashion, but what she's holding is an 18th century fan, and it's a fan that belonged to Morisot herself. As the artist put it, I like either extreme novelty or things of the past.
Gosh, how lovely. It's very beautiful with that image from Watteau, isn't it? On the one of the sort of fête galante or
It's
Yes.
gorgeous. It's so delicate. It's a shepherd and shepherdess talking of love. And you can see that Morisot translates it into much bolder Impressionist style. But that subject, I think the idea is that this very introspective young woman with the fan pressed to her cheek, her thoughts are about love. So it's a coded inclusion as well.
Right. So, and Morisot and her husband actually furnished their home with 18th century furniture. Is that right? I think you told me that.
They did indeed. So in the early 1880s, they had a new family home built in the Passy district of Paris, which they decorated in the 18th century style. But even before that, they owned 18th century furnishings. So we're looking here at a picture that Morisot began in the 1870s, and it shows one of her models sitting at the mirror in Morisot's own bedroom. And that's important. Morisot never had a studio. She preferred to work in real interiors to capture genuine lived experience. So this model is sitting at the mirror in Morisot's own bedroom, possibly wearing one of Morisot's own dresses. And then in the background is her bed, and it is an 18th century Louis XVI style bed. And you can see that once again, the critics make that connection. Paul Mance here, everything floats, nothing is formulated. The tone itself hesitates indecisively, and there is here a finesse like that found in Fragonard. So it's really, sorry.
No, it's beautiful.
It is beautiful. It's a really personal picture, but I think there's something very interesting going on here, that Morisot is also responding to those 18th century pictures that were so popular, showing young women dressing and undressing in intimate spaces. And what Morisot does is bring a new feminine perspective to that subject. So this young woman isn't looking out at us flirtatiously. You get a real sense of introspection. And for me, that's one of the most special qualities of her art.
Yes, that's fascinating. And there was a legend, wasn't there, that she was, or a story circulating that she was actually related to Fragonard. Was that correct?
It's correct that there was a legend, but it is absolutely a myth, and it was inadvertently advanced by her friend, the poet Stéphane Mallarmé. He wrote a preface to the memorial exhibition of her work in 1896, and in it he describes her as the great grandniece of Fragonard. And he meant this figuratively, but others assumed he meant it as fact, and it got written into all of the biographies. And actually, it's my colleague at the Marmottan Museum in Paris, Claire Gooden, in research for this exhibition, who has definitively proved that they were not related. Morisot's grandfather worked alongside Fragonard's son on a couple of projects, but they were colleagues rather than relations. But when you look at pictures like these two together, you can see why her contemporaries wanted to believe this myth. There's a similar freedom in the brushwork, a really deft characterization, and those very elegant female subjects. So yes, she was linked with Fragonard, but actually the artist, the French 18th century artist she was most interested in was Boucher. As a teenager, her first painting teacher had encouraged her to learn by copying from paintings in the Louvre. And what's so unusual about Morisot, that was quite a standard part of artistic training. But then as a mature artist in her 40s, in her 50s, Morisot returns to museums with her palette and brushes, not to copy, but to make her own translations of 18th century paintings. And the artist who she returns to again and again is Boucher. So you see her here on the left. She has picked out those two woodland nymphs embracing from a huge mythological painting by Boucher, where the main subject is Apollo appearing in this blaze of glory to a shepherdess. But she's translated it into her own visual language. And her colleague Manet, in fact, was very impressed by her version, and he insisted that it should be included in that memorial exhibition. And when you look at those mauve and pink and green tones and the long sinewy brushwork, it's rather like what he went on to do with his water lilies.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I'm certainly not a 19th century specialist by any means. I like going to galleries and looking at Impressionist paintings, but I had no idea that there was a link to earlier artistic traditions. I thought what they were doing was just totally sort of new, and actually, of course, it was new, but it's a sort of rediscovery and a reinterpretation, isn't it, of these artists in terms of imagery and the use of light and brushwork and all that.
It absolutely is. And I think that combination that you've picked at is key, because there were two aspects to her training. She learned with Joseph Benoit Guichard, who took her to the Louvre to copy masterpieces. But then she and her sister Edma asked to study with the landscape painter Camille Corot. And what they wanted to do was to learn to paint swift outdoor sketches. And I think those twin aspects of her training really shape her work, looking to the art of the past, but doing something new and always bringing light into the pictures. This is another copy she made of Boucher, and actually this one, or another translation, I should say, this one was incorporated into the paneling of that 18th century reception room in the home that she and Eugène had built.
Gosh. So in December, so her interest, her interest in English art was quite strong, wasn't it? Because I believe that she and her husband, Eugène Manet, actually came to England on their honeymoon, and that this was a life-changing experience for her. Is that right?
They did indeed. And this interest in English art is especially important. And that is a story that we tell in the exhibition for the first time. So in December 1874, Berthe Morisot married Eugène Manet, brother of Edouard. And in August 1875, they came on honeymoon to England. And here Morisot paints Eugène looking out through the open sitting room window of Globe Cottage in West on the Isle of Wight. He's looking across the garden onto the parade. There's a nanny walking with a little girl, and beyond them you've got the yachts and the steamboat gathered at the pier. And what I love about this picture is that Eugène is not sitting on that chair. He is twisting around. He's got his binoculars in his hand. He's got his boater and blazer on, and he is ready to go out. And there would have been so much to see, because their honeymoon coincided with the Royal Yacht Squadron regatta. And of course, the Isle of Wight had been a hugely fashionable destination ever since Queen Victoria had chosen it as the location for her palatial holiday home, Osborne House. And actually their honeymoon also incorporated a day at Goodwood Races before they arrived on the Isle of Wight. So it's including two of the most highly anticipated events of the English summer season. And one of the reasons that Morisot comes to England is that she was considering establishing her career here, rather like her compatriot James Tissot, whose work you see here on the screen. This is his painting of a ball taking place during the Cowes Regatta Week that was exhibited at the Royal Academy the year before in 1874. And he was making a fortune painting pictures like this of Victorian high society. He was selling pictures for 300,000 francs a time, which, to put it in context, Monet's first London pictures were sold to the dealer Durand Ruel for 200 francs. Uh-huh. So Tissot really was living like a king. But Morisot ultimately decided that England wasn't for her. She writes that English society seems as dull as it is wealthy. And she says she's not sure how they can make a start without their own yacht and several million a year. But instead, she makes a discovery on the Isle of Wight that really shapes her art in other ways. So on a day trip to Ryde, she discovers what she describes as a superb Reynolds for sale for little less than 2 francs. It's obviously not this one. It was probably a print or possibly a drawing. But then when she gets to London, she visits all of the major collections, the museums, the private collections, and what she sees really inspires a lifelong enthusiasm for the art of Reynolds and Gainsborough and Romney. And one of the great pleasures of this exhibition has been the detective work of piecing together what it is that she might have seen from the hints in her letters and notebooks, looking at what was on display and then seeing connections to her later art. So at the National Gallery, it was particularly Reynolds who caught her eye, and it was his sentimental pictures of children that were especially popular in Victorian England. And this is Lady Frances Gordon, aged 5, being depicted as an angel from different perspectives. And you can see on that guidebook lower right, this was the illustrated guidebook to the National Gallery for 1877. And Henry Blackburn has actually chosen that image as the title page illustration. Over 300 copies were made of it by artists working in the gallery during Morisot's lifetime. And you can see her own debt 10 years later, 10 years later, painting her daughter Julie with her doll, that same golden hair, heart-shaped face, rosebud lips. So the artists that she keeps mentioning are Reynolds and Gainsborough and Romney, and one of the Gainsborough paintings she would have seen in the Duke of Westminster's collection at Grosvenor House was Gainsborough's Blue Boy, famously painted to challenge Reynolds' assertion that it wasn't possible to paint a picture all blue that would be successful. I think Gainsborough definitely won that argument. And you can see again, it makes a lasting impression because it's much later in the early 1890s that Morisot paints her own blue girl to match Gainsborough's Blue Boy. And her daughter actually writes about this in her journal. She says, this little girl at the piano, Lucy Leon, it was hot. Lucy would have preferred to play croquet rather than pose at the piano. She was an unbearable model, but as mother overcame every difficulty, she created a marvelous portrait, all blue, like the Blue Boy by Gainsborough. Lucy is jolly lucky to have this magnificent work of art after doing nothing to deserve it. So we've very much been taking Morisot's writings and the writings of her family and her associates as the lead for this exhibition. And sometimes the detective trail can be like really tantalizing. This is Morisot writing to her sister Edma, recommending what Edma might see when she comes to London. And she says that she's enclosing a note of places to go. She knows they visited the Duke of Westminster and Lord Sutherland. And then she says, I think I visited others, but I don't recall the names. Yes. So I've been looking and thinking where else she might have gone. And I think one of the places that she visited was the collection at Hertford House, which is now open to the public as the Wallace Collection. It wasn't open to the public at that point. There was building work going on that year whilst Sir Richard Wallace was having it extended. But Morisot was staying in a boarding house at 51 Manchester Street, circled on the screen here, literally over the road from Hertford House.
Oh, she must have, yes.
I think, well, she would have known about their French collection, yes, definitely, because the Marquis of Hertford had been really generous lender to a blockbuster exhibition in Paris in 1860, all about French 18th century art. But the reason I think she actually knocked on the door is this. So in notebooks later on, she describes Romney as one of her favorite artists. But when I looked, there were only 3 Romneys on possible public display in London when she visited. And on the left here, this one from the Wallace collection is a portrait of the actress, Mrs. Mary Robinson. She was especially famous for playing Perdita in Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. And she also had a notorious but brief affair with the future George IV. And you can see on the right, Morisot's painting of an anonymous Parisienne, painted exactly 100 years later in 1880, is so visually similar. The tilt of the head, the way these women look out at us as if they're daring the viewer to challenge her. Their fashionable hats matching the tone of their hair, and then their hands tucked into this winter muff. And you have to be really rigorous when you get hunches like this. And I did check, and I found that Morisot could have seen a reproduction of the portrait in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts in 1872. but the reproduction was an illustration to an article about Reynolds, and it had been mislabeled as a Reynolds. In fact, it was the only illustration in an article that was meant to introduce the French readership to Reynolds, so a bit of a picture research disaster. I think we can excuse them because the Hertford collection includes portraits of Mrs. Robinson by Gainsborough and Reynolds and Romney. So if she'd seen it there, she wouldn't have known it was a Romney. And as I say, she later says he's one of her favourite artists. But I think also the similarity of scale and that loosely brushed backdrop, I'm pretty sure she knocked
yes,
that
yes, yeah. And do we know whether she visited the Dulwich Picture Gallery?
That is another tantalizing question. She must have known about it. Her colleagues Monet and Pissarro knew it well. Monet signed the visitor book in November 1870 when he was in London as a refugee from the Franco-Prussian War. Pissarro as well spent those war years living close by, signed the visitor book in April 1871. Tissot as well would have known it. I mean, it really always has been a major destination for art lovers. And we know that Morisot came within 2 miles of it because she arrived in London with a letter of introduction to the Dean of Westminster Abbey, Dr. Stanley, and he was spending the summer at Norwood, really close to the gallery, really close to the Crystal Palace. We can't prove that she came because there is no visitor book for Dulwich Picture Gallery for August 1875. But what I've done for the exhibition is create an audio trail through the main collection galleries, picking out the pictures that I know would have caught her eye if she visited.
Mm. And was her interest in the 18th century more than just the imagery? Was it also in the materials? Because they became very famous for those images with pastel, with trois crayons and that sort of thing, weren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we've been able to include some wonderful works on paper in the exhibition. In the late 1880s, she started experimenting with red chalk, which is very closely associated with 18th century artists. And she was really encouraged in this by her friends Renoir and Degas. And actually, the drawing on the right was part of Degas' collection. It's by Fragonard. It probably shows his daughter Rosalie. And it's really exemplifies that virtuosic 18th century technique. You've got these wonderful sharp details done with pointed chalk. Then you've got the side of the chalk being used to create softer tones. It's really sparkling. But what's so wonderful is if you look at how Morisot uses her chalk, she does it in such a different way. So on the left is a picture of her favorite model, her 10-year-old daughter, Julie, sitting up in a tree. And you can see it's been done so swiftly, the tree and the girl shaded in those diagonal strokes so that they are one visual entity. And you realize that chalk was really practical for her because she could just have it in a pocket, whisk it out to capture fleeting moments of family life. And you mentioned pastel, which is, of course, a medium that she worked with right through her career. Some of her earliest exhibits at the Paris Salon were highly finished pastel portraits of her mother and her sisters. And she especially admired the work of Perronneau. And we're delighted we've been able to include this particular portrait of a gentleman, which was in the Gruel collection. And she especially notes the virtuosity of his portraits in the Gruel collection. And again, a real demonstration of the finesse of 18th century technique. You've got all those layers of blue pastel smudged together with a stump for the velvet jacket and the waistcoat. Then the fine details of the cravat, that would be done by sharpening your pastel, dipping it in water. The face so beautifully modeled with parallel strokes, and then it's got these sparkling highlights in the eyes. But again, when you look at how Morisot uses pastel, particularly later on in the 1890s, it's much looser. And what she loved about it was that she could explore ideas swiftly, but also in color. And that meant when she then goes on to paint the same subject, she can look as though she's improvising because she's already planned some of what she's going to do.
Gosh. And now I suppose is the big question. So, I mean, obviously I'd seen paintings by Morisot, but I didn't realize until this exhibition just how important she was. And you mentioned earlier that this is the first exhibition of her work in the UK since the 1950s, I think you said. So why has she been overlooked?
That's right, 1950, 73 years ago, a real once in a lifetime opportunity. She certainly wasn't overlooked in her own lifetime. She was hugely admired both by her colleagues. She got lots of wonderful reviews in the press. But then she did become partly obscured from view. And that's, I think there are two main reasons. One is the history of collecting. We have this really poignant portrait at the end of the exhibition, which shows her daughter Julie, aged 14, and she's in mourning for her father, Eugène, who had died the year before. And you can see she's caressing her pet greyhound, which was actually a gift from Mallarmé to console her following her father's death. And then on the left, you've got that empty chair, which is so evocative of absence and loss. And what's so poignant about this picture is that within 2 years, Julie would actually be an orphan because Morisot caught flu after nursing Julie through the illness. Then she succumbed to pneumonia and she died on the 2nd of March, 1895, aged just 54. Now, Julie was just 16, and it meant that many of the paintings remained with Julie as her legacy. And she did a wonderful job of looking after her mother's reputation. It was, in fact, Julie who curated the 1950 Arts Council exhibition here in the UK. But because there weren't so many of her works in public collections, there were not so many opportunities to see her work. There were obviously wonderful examples in the Musée d'Orsay and around Europe, in America, but it's really the major bequests from her descendants in the 1990s to the Musée Marmottan that meant that it was possible to do more international exhibitions. I think the other reason that she was rather overlooked is also to do with the way that art history was written in the early 20th century, which very much prioritized the male artists. And I'm showing you here just two of Edouard Manet's stunning portraits of Berthe Morisot. He made 12 of her altogether. And I think the tendency amongst, shall we say, male art historians in the early 20th century was to see her as Manet's muse. And I deliberately chose not to include any of Manet's portraits of her in this exhibition, or indeed any works by her male Impressionist contemporaries, because I wanted her to have this solo moment. But actually that Manet-Morisot relationship is interesting for far more reasons than the fact that he was fascinated by her. Because if you look at their works alongside, you can see that often he is referencing her, really admiring her own art in his paintings. So when he paints her leaning back on that sofa in the portrait called Repose, she is wearing a polka dot dress, a black choker. She's got her hair in the long dark curls, relaxing on a sofa with a fan, just like the picture she had made of two sisters a few years earlier. So it's not just a case of her inspiring Manet or of her being influenced by his work. It's real mutual admiration going on. And we have the portrait on the left is in the exhibition at Dulwich. And here I think we see Morisot making her own homage to Manet. It's a portrait of her great friend, Louise Friesner, who was the great-granddaughter of the royal cabinet maker, Riesner, who made furniture for Queen Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. And very appropriately, Morisot has placed her beside this 18th century Louis XV marquetry table, but it's one that was a Manet family heirloom. And you can see on the right, it appears in Manet's picture, Nana, in a very, very different context, where you've got this young woman in her corset and her male top-hatted client beside her. But I think this is Morisot. It's almost like a memorial to Manet, because he had, of course, died in 1883. And I think that little flower on that Manet table in the corner is a little private memory there.
Gosh. Well, I need to stop talking. This is so interesting, but I want to ask you quickly one last question before we open up to questions from our attendees, which is, where does the exhibition go next? Does it go, it goes to the Musée Marmottan, is that right? And they have been actively involved in this exhibition, haven't they?
It does indeed. They have been the most wonderful partners for this exhibition. And in fact, we first approached them asking if we could borrow significant works for the exhibition. And their response was, yes, and we would like to partner with you, which was the most wonderful turn of events. So a version of the exhibition is traveling to Paris in October. It will have a different shape there because the Marmottan have a permanent collection of Morisot's work. Their audience are familiar with her as an artist, so they'll be telling the story in a different way, but it's wonderful that it's going to have that other afterlife once it closes here in Dulwich.
Wonderful. Well, I think I'm going to stop asking you questions now, and I'm going to open the floor to anybody else who'd like to ask a question. The easiest way to do it is probably to maybe raise your hand or unmute yourself, and we will I'll try and spot you, and my colleague Han, who's also here, will hopefully help me as well to spot if people ask a question.